The auditorium buzzed with quiet tension until a single sentence cut through the air like a blade. Jesus is just a fairy tale. The words came from Professor Daniel Hargrove, standing tall before a crowd of college students at the University of New Hampshire. His voice was smooth, but his message? Blunt, dismissive, dangerous. Religion, he claimed, has held humanity back for centuries. It's time we outgrow these myths. Some students nodded. Others looked down, uneasy. Phones started recording. A moment was happening. Down the hall, Karoline Leavitt, 27 years old, the youngest White House press secretary in American history, had just arrived to speak on Gen Z and politics. But before she could even reach the stage, she heard it. That sentence, that insult. And in that moment, she stopped walking. Her breath caught, her hand clenched. This wasn't just political, it was personal. Because the man they just called a fairy tale, that's the cornerstone of her faith, and she wasn't about to let it go unanswered. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching from, and subscribe if you believe truth deserves a voice. The air inside the University of New Hampshire's largest lecture hall was thick with anticipation, though no one quite knew why. Rain tapped gently against the windows like a soft metronome, the only real sound before the professor arrived. And then, he did. Professor Daniel Hargrove swept into the auditorium with a confidence that seemed carved from stone. A tall man with salt and pepper hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of smirk that came not from joy but from long-held certainty. He didn't wear the humble air of an educator. No, Hargrove wore authority like armor. He walked to the podium and scanned the room. His eyes were sharp and cool, calculating, waiting, measuring. The chatter died instantly. Everyone knew today's topic was controversial, and everyone also knew Hargrove loved controversy. He thrived in it. He fed off of gasps and wide eyes the way some feed on applause. He tapped the microphone once, a low thump echoing off the wood-paneled walls. Then he began, not with a warm welcome or a preamble, but with a blade. It's time we move past the myths. A few students leaned in. Others glanced up warily from their phones. Religion, he continued, has held humanity back for centuries. It's been used to justify wars, oppress the weak, and silence reason. And the greatest myth of them all? He paused, letting the silence drip like poison into every ear. Is Jesus. A nervous murmur rose in the back, but Hargrove didn't pause. In fact, he smiled. Let's be clear, he said, locking eyes with a student in the front row, who immediately looked away. Jesus is nothing more than a fairy tale. The words cut clean through the air. The silence that followed wasn't the respectful kind. It was stunned, stiff, personal. Something sacred had just been dragged into the dirt. You could feel it. Some students froze. Others shifted in their seats. A few smirked along with him, eager acolytes of his sharp intellect. But most just looked uncomfortable, not because they didn't know what to think, but because they did, and didn't have the courage to say it. Phones came out quietly. Recordings began. History, after all, has many witnesses, but very few who are willing to stand up in the middle of it. What no one noticed, at least not yet, was the sound of heels echoing down the tiled hallway just beyond the auditorium door. Karoline Leavitt wasn't supposed to be there yet. The White House press secretary, just 27 years old, had been invited as a guest speaker to address the political awakenings of Gen Z and the importance of civic engagement. But fate doesn't ask permission before flipping the script. She'd arrived early. As she turned the corner near the lecture hall, she caught the last few words of Hargrove's opening. Through the open double doors, through the thick hum of shock rippling inside. Jesus is just a fairy tale. Karoline froze. Not because she was unsure of what to do, but because her entire body reacted, like it knew before her mind did. This was not a moment to ignore. Her hand tightened around the leather portfolio she held. Her throat dried. It was a sensation she knew well, not from fear, but from righteous adrenaline. She'd felt it behind the podium at White House briefings when she'd defended freedom of speech, religious liberties, and the right to believe against the cynical eye rolls of media elites. But this time, it was different. This time, it was personal. This time, someone had publicly insulted not just her beliefs, but the very foundation of her faith. The name she whispered in prayer during hard nights with her newborn son. The teachings that guided her as a young girl growing up in New Hampshire. The strength that had pulled her through loss, through doubt, through sleepless political nights when everything felt stacked against her. Jesus, a fairy tale? Her jaw tightened. That wasn't just wrong. That was a lie dressed in the robes of intellect. And someone needed to say so. Her steps turned deliberate. The hallway grew narrower with every beat of her heels against the tile. Click, click, click. It wasn't the march of a woman heading to a polite campus engagement. It was the quiet thunder of someone who had just been called to battle, and answered without hesitation. Inside the hall, Professor Hargrove launched into his usual routine, quoting Richard Dawkins, dismissing the Gospels as primitive tribal literature, making comparisons to Zeus and Hercules, like a magician pulling from a bag of tired tricks. The audience listened, or pretended to, but the room felt different now. And then, without fanfare, the door opened. Heads turned. Students whispered. A few of them sat up straighter, the glow of recognition flickering across their faces. "Isn't that's Karoline Leavitt." She didn't smile, didn't wave. She just walked. Her deep blue suit cut through the muted tones of the auditorium like a banner. Her presence was magnetic, unexpected and commanding. You could feel the axis of the room tilt. Professor Hargrove blinked, thrown just slightly off rhythm. His next sentence came slower, less certain. He knew who she was. Everyone did. The youngest press secretary in U.S. history, a rising star in American politics. The conservative voice Gen Z actually listened to. He straightened himself, smiled tightly, tried to maintain control of the stage. Karoline? She didn't take the stage. She didn't need to. She stopped right in the center aisle, planted her feet, her eyes sharp, alive, locked on the man behind the podium. The room held its breath. Then she spoke. "Professor," she said, her voice clear but restrained, "I wasn't scheduled to speak just yet. But I couldn't stay quiet after what I just heard." The students froze. The moment felt thick, charged with something no lecture could generate. Truth, conviction, fire. Hargrove chuckled lightly, but there was no humor in it. "And who might you be?" he asked, already knowing. "A political guest, I assume. Here to sell us another story?" Karoline didn't blink. "I'm not here to sell anything," she said calmly, "but I will correct a lie, especially one spoken with such arrogance." Gasps, whispers. Eyes darted between her and the professor like spectators at a tennis match, waiting for the next blow. "Jesus is not a fairy tale," she continued, "and calling him one doesn't make you enlightened. It just makes you ignorant of both faith and history." The silence after her words was deeper than before. This wasn't a polite disagreement. This was a line in the sand. And Karoline had just drawn it. In that single moment, before a debate had even begun, she had already said what dozens in that room had felt but were too afraid to say. You don't get to mock faith and call it intelligence. She didn't speak as a press secretary. She spoke as a believer, as a daughter, as a mother, as someone who knew the weight and meaning behind the name Jesus. Not as mythology, but as the living core of everything she stood for. And that changed everything. Students who had slouched now sat upright. Phones angled more sharply. And Hargrove, his smirk faded just slightly, not because he was afraid, but because he realized. He wasn't the only authority in the room anymore. And that's when the real story began. The hush that followed Karoline's words hung heavy, like fog settling in a valley before the storm breaks. Professor Daniel Hargrove, who had never been publicly challenged in his own lecture hall, let alone by someone with national credentials, tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle he hadn't expected to solve today. "So, we're correcting professors now?" he said coolly. "And what credentials do you bring with your indignation? White House press releases, or just Sunday school emotions?" Some students chuckled, but it wasn't laughter. It was nervousness disguised. Everyone knew the tone, the sneering academic dismissal of anyone who dared bring morality into a space that worshipped intellect. Karoline didn't flinch. She didn't respond to his jab. Instead, she let silence do the work. And when she finally spoke, her voice didn't rise. It dropped, just slightly. Controlled. Surgical. "I bring truth," she said, "and the courage to speak it, something I suspect many in this room have, but haven't been given permission to show." A quiet ripple swept through the crowd. Phones were already out. Some students began recording from their laps. Others live texted, whispering to their neighbors. The camera lens of public attention had officially entered the room, invited not by controversy, but by conviction. The professor stepped away from the podium. He could feel the eyes shifting from him to her. He knew he had to regain the upper hand. "Let's reorient the conversation," he said, turning back to the class like Karoline wasn't there. "Today's lecture is on comparative mythology. We're discussing the recurring pattern of god figures in human history: Osiris, Mithras, Dionysus, and yes, Jesus." He emphasized the name with a smirk. "And as I stated earlier, there is no serious academic consensus that places Jesus of Nazareth as anything more than an embellished tale, a legend, a symbol used to control the masses." He spoke as if reading from stone tablets of his own design, carved in ego, not truth. But Karoline took a step forward. She didn't speak yet. She just stood, deliberately, not at the podium, but on the floor, with the students, among the people. She glanced up at the professor, then slowly turned her attention to the students in front of her. "If you believe in faith," she said, "or even if you're just curious about whether history has been manipulated to serve someone's narrative, I invite you to listen. Not debate, not argue. Listen." And that simple invitation shifted the tone. Hargrove interrupted, scoffing loudly. "Don't mistake storytelling for substance," he snapped. "The story of Jesus has the same plot structure as Hercules or Thor: a miraculous birth, a divine mission, a tragic death. It's a narrative device, not a historical figure." He turned toward the whiteboard and began drawing a timeline, placing Jesus in quotation marks between mythological icons. "The Bible," he said over his shoulder, "was written decades after these so-called events. No eyewitness accounts, no Roman records, just borrowed legend, reused to maintain power." That's when Karoline's eyes narrowed. "Then how do you explain Tacitus?" she said sharply, interrupting his momentum. "Or Suetonius? Or Josephus?" The chalk froze in his hand. "All non-Christian sources," she continued, "who reference Jesus as a real man who lived in Judea, was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and left such an impression that the movement outlasted empires." The room stilled. Students began Googling, typing furiously, searching Tacitus Jesus reference, Josephus Jewish historian. She saw it. She saw the light come into their eyes, not from being told what to think, but from the chance to actually think. One girl in the front row looked up from her phone and whispered to her friend, "She's right. Tacitus actually wrote about it in the annals." Karoline leaned in just slightly, her voice firm but calm. "I'm not asking you to believe in miracles. I'm not asking you to accept divinity. But I am asking you to recognize something simple and powerful. You've been fed a narrative that faith is weakness, that believing in something bigger than yourself is childish." She let that land. "But I'm telling you now, faith, especially when it's informed by truth and tested in fire, is not weakness. It's strength." Professor Hargrove straightened up, face flushed. He wasn't used to losing control of the room. "This is my class," he said tightly, "and I won't allow it to become a political soapbox." Karoline met his glare with steel in her eyes. "Then let's stick to history," she replied. "Let's talk about how one carpenter from a backwater province changed the structure of Western law, ethics, charity, and justice. Let's talk about the millions of documents outside the Bible that verify his existence. Let's talk about the Roman historian who hated Christians but still wrote about Jesus because his presence in history couldn't be denied. That's not soapboxing. That's documented reality." Another ripple through the room. More students started recording. One guy near the back muttered, "She's smoking him." The professor tried one last pivot. "You're just here to stir emotion," he said. "Faith is about feelings. Academia is about facts." Caroline's voice dropped lower now, carrying more weight. "Number faith is about conviction, about walking through fire without proof of escape. Academia should be about facts, but you've used it as a shield to mock those who believe differently. You didn't open this lecture with inquiry. You opened it with mockery." A pause. "And I won't let the next generation think that's courage." Silence. A holy kind of silence. And then, without cue, a girl clapped. Just once. Then again. A second student joined her, then a third. Hargrove stared in stunned silence as the very students he lectured weekly, whom he had shaped for years, applauded the woman who had been in the room for barely 10 minutes. Karoline didn't smile. She just nodded once, acknowledging the students, not basking in their praise. This wasn't about popularity, it was about truth. And truth, when spoken boldly, doesn't need applause. By this point, TikTok clips were already uploading. Students were posting, "You won't believe what happened in class today," with shaky footage and wide-eyed captions. A moment had begun to ripple outward, but inside the auditorium, the atmosphere remained taut, alive with energy. This wasn't a classroom anymore. It had become an arena. And in that arena, one professor's academic cynicism had finally met its match, in the form of a young woman who didn't come to win arguments. She came to defend what mattered most. The moment had shifted. The room, once dominated by Professor Hargrove's certainty and theatrical dismissiveness, now pulsed with a different energy. Karoline didn't stand behind a podium. She didn't pace the floor like a performer. She stood still, anchored by truth, not applause. And then she walked, slowly, calmly, down the center aisle, her heels striking the floor like steady drums in a war that had long been waged in silence. Each step forward wasn't just toward the front of the classroom. It was toward every student who'd ever sat in a seat like this, listening to faith mocked, morals dismantled, and truth twisted into punchlines. The room held its breath. "Do you know what I find interesting, Professor?" she said, stopping just feet from the elevated stage where he stood like a king before his court. "You opened this lecture claiming to stand for truth, for facts, for reason. But when it comes to the most historically documented figure in ancient times, Jesus of Nazareth, you reduce him to fiction because he doesn't fit your worldview." The professor scoffed and stepped forward, arms crossed. "You mistake tradition for truth, Ms. Leavitt," he said, clearly irritated. "You mistake emotion for evidence." Caroline's gaze didn't waver. She was calm, but there was heat behind her words. Not anger, conviction. "You want evidence?" she said. "Let's talk Tacitus, a Roman historian who despised Christians, yet still documented Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Let's talk Josephus, a first-century Jewish scholar who never followed Jesus, but wrote clearly about his existence, his teachings, and his death. These aren't church sources, they're secular historians, writing outside the Bible. And you know that. But you stood here and told these students Jesus is no more real than Zeus." Her voice rose, just slightly, not to shout, to pierce. "That's not education, that's indoctrination in reverse." A visible shift spread through the rows of students. Some looked down, wrestling with a cognitive dissonance they hadn't been prepared to confront. Others leaned forward, visibly energized. One guy whispered to his friend, "She's torching him." The professor straightened, clearly rattled but still trying to maintain the upper hand. "You cherry-pick ancient references," he snapped. "Scattered mentions in texts written decades after Jesus supposedly lived. That's not proof. That's hearsay from ancient gossip." Karoline tilted her head slightly, her expression one of both defiance and sadness. "Even if we ignored the historical evidence, Professor, what do you make of the impact? Fairy tales don't change civilizations. They don't build hospitals, inspire the foundation of human rights, or drive people to sacrifice their lives for something greater than themselves. Jesus wasn't a myth. He was a movement, one that reshaped history. And deep down, I think you know that." The room crackled with tension. And then, a student near the front raised his hand. "Miss Leavitt, he asked, hesitant but sincere. Do you really believe all of it? The miracles? The resurrection? Karoline turned to face him. Her expression softened, but didn't shrink. She could have dodged it, given the safe political answer, but she didn't. I believe in the man who forgave his killers as they nailed him to a cross, she said gently. I believe in the teacher who said, love your enemies in a world obsessed with revenge. I believe in the power of redemption because I've seen it save people. Miracles? That's for each of us to wrestle with. But to deny he ever existed? To pretend his life and legacy were made up? That's not skepticism. That's arrogance disguised as scholarship. A beat of silence. Then, someone clapped. Then another. The professor looked out over his students and saw something he hadn't seen in years. Resistance, not disrespect, but something worse in his view. Independent thought. Professor Hargrove's jaw clenched. His hands tightened around the edges of the podium. The control he had so carefully curated was cracking, right there in front of him, in the presence of a young woman with no degree in theology, no title in academia. Just truth. You think quoting Tacitus makes you a historian? He said, his voice rising slightly. You think standing in here with your blue suit and press credentials makes you qualified to lecture me? Karoline didn't back down. No, she said calmly, but standing for truth? That qualifies everyone. He scoffed again, louder this time, his tone sharper, biting. You're just like the rest of your camp, emotional, desperate for validation, clinging to ancient stories because they make you feel safe. Jesus walked on water? Raised the dead? Turned water into wine? You honestly expect educated people to believe that? Karoline took a slow breath. No, she replied. I expect educated people to consider the possibility that not everything true can be measured in a lab. I expect intellectual honesty, not mockery masquerading as reason. The words struck harder than she intended, because for the first time Hargrove didn't answer. He stared at her for a long moment, and the silence, it wasn't defiance, it was hesitation. The room noticed. His students noticed. He looked down, fumbled with his notes, then looked up again, masking it with sarcasm. You know, Ms. Leavitt, the only reason anyone claps for you is because you're good at this. You perform well. That's what press secretaries are trained to do. Karoline's face softened, not out of pity, but out of resolve. You think this is performance? She said, stepping even closer now. Number what you're watching is something you forgot how to do a long time ago. Believe. Her words echoed louder than any mic could project. A student in the back shouted, She's not wrong. Another whispered, Is he actually thinking about this? The professor's next line was supposed to be a rebuke, but it didn't come. Instead, he lowered his eyes, just for a second, just enough for the room to realize Karoline hadn't just won an argument. She'd cracked a wall. And what followed was silence. Not the awkward kind, the reverent kind. A moment when something unspoken breaks through. That maybe, just maybe, the person who came to lecture had been taught. And that's when it all started to change. The tension in the lecture hall had broken, but not like glass shattering. It had melted, like snow on the first day of spring. Professor Daniel Hargrove stood motionless behind the podium, his fingers no longer clenched. His gaze wasn't defiant anymore. It was distant. He was staring at something only he could see. Memories maybe. Regrets. A younger version of himself. The one who once asked questions before mocking the answers. And across from him stood Karoline Leavitt, not on the podium, not in a place of authority, just standing, strong, grounded, undiminished. For a full 10 seconds, the room was silent, reverent, and then it began. One student, without saying a word, lowered their phone and started to clap. Not for drama, not for sides, but for truth. Others joined, tentative at first, then a wave. Applause thundered through the hall, not wild or riotous, but deep and human. The kind that comes when people know they've seen something real. Karoline didn't smile for the crowd. She didn't raise her hands or take a bow. She simply nodded once, then turned toward the professor. Not as a rival, but as a fellow human. Thank you for the space, Professor, she said quietly. I know it wasn't easy. Hargrove didn't respond. Not at first. He simply nodded, a gesture that said more than words ever could. Then, with eyes still locked on hers, he said something no one expected. I'll reread Tacitus. A ripple of breath swept through the room. It was small, but it was everything. Later that afternoon, Karoline sat quietly on a bench just outside the auditorium. The sun had emerged from behind the clouds, casting long gold beams across the New Hampshire campus. Her phone buzzed nonstop, notifications piling up like autumn leaves. The debate was already trending. White House press secretary destroys atheist professor. Karoline Leavitt versus academia. Jesus is not a fairy tale. Faith vs. mockery. So Karoline claps back. TikTok clips had already gone viral. Students' captions range from, "She made me want to believe again. This is why Gen Z isn't giving up on God. She came in like a storm and left like a light." Karoline watched them roll in, quietly. She didn't bask in it. She'd never needed praise. But something deeper settled in her heart. She had said what needed to be said, and it mattered. Back inside, Professor Hargrove stood in his office, alone. He closed the door behind him, not to shut the world out, but to reflect without the noise. He walked to his bookshelf, ran his hand along dusty spines until it landed on a worn volume. Tacitus. He hadn't touched it in years. He opened it. Pages cracked faintly under his fingers. And for the first time in a long time, he read, not to disprove, but to understand. And there in the quiet, with only the sound of rain returning outside his window, a professor finally remembered what it meant to question with humility. Meanwhile, Karoline's phone buzzed again, a text from her husband. "Little man just fell asleep. We're proud of you. Tell me everything when you're home." She smiled, fingers pausing over the keyboard before replying. It was wild, but it was worth it. Truth always is. She looked down the path ahead, students still talking in small circles, still debating, still wrestling with what they had just witnessed. Some were changed, some just shaken, but all of them had seen. They saw a woman, young, bold, unapologetic, walk into a hostile room and stand. As the sun set behind the trees, one student posted a final video clip. Just Karoline's words, no edits, no music. "You don't have to believe he walked on water, but don't pretend he never walked this earth. If this story moved you, if you believe faith still matters in a world that mocks it, if you think courage can still cut through cynicism, then share this. Tell your story, leave a comment, join the conversation. And remember, you don't need a podium to speak the truth. You just need a voice that won't stay silent. Let's subscribe for more stories that matter, because truth isn't trending, but it's still worth defending.